Charlotte was an ordinary woman living a quiet yet meaningful life. She worked as a nurse at the local hospital, and her days were filled with caring for others. Despite her exhaustion, she took pride in her work. This was one of those evenings when she had to stay late, helping a critically ill patient. She was on her way home later than usual, around 10 o'clock. The streets were almost empty. The air was cool, and the soft yellow glow of the streetlights cast long shadows. Charlotte knew the area well. It had always felt safe to her. But that evening she had a strange feeling, as if someone was watching her. Turning around, she noticed a group of men walking behind her. Their loud laughter and crude jokes echoed down the street. Charlotte tried to quicken her pace, but the men caught up to her. They surrounded her in a semicircle, blocking her way. One of them, tall and brash, smirked. "Hey, where are you rushing off to, sweetheart?" The others laughed, picking up on his tone. Charlotte, keeping her composure, replied calmly, "I'm just heading home. Please let me pass." But instead of stepping aside, the men only got louder. One of them glanced around and spotted a garbage bin nearby. It seemed to spark an idea. He turned to his friends and suggested, "Hey, how about we give her a little shower? She looks a bit too clean for this neighborhood." The others clapped and cheered at the suggestion as if it were the funniest joke they'd ever heard. Before Charlotte could react, two of the men moved to the bin, grabbed heavy garbage bags, and brought them over to her. The others held Charlotte back so she couldn't escape. The bags tore open over her head, and rotten food scraps, trash, dirt, and foul-smelling waste poured down on her. Charlotte froze in shock, unable to process what was happening. She could hear nothing but the loud laughter of the men, who were taking pictures and shouting insults. "Get a shot of this, man! What a picture!" The filth dripped down her clothes, and her hair was matted with trash. But what hurt her most were the words they shouted, words meant to degrade and humiliate her. Finally, satisfied with their fun, the men walked away, leaving her standing there, humiliated and covered in garbage. Charlotte, feeling a wave of despair, thought about letting the evening pass, burying it deep within her memory. But something inside her rebelled against the injustice. "They will pay for this," she said to herself, looking toward the distant light shining from her home's window. She knew her husband Daniel would be waiting for her. He was a man of the law, a man she could trust. And she knew this incident could not be allowed to go unanswered. This part sets the stage for the central conflict, the cruelty and humiliation Charlotte endures, which becomes the catalyst for the story's unfolding events. Charlotte walked into her home, holding back tears as she opened the door. She didn't want her 12-year-old son to see her like this. Thankfully, he was already asleep. The house was quiet, but the kitchen light was on, and Daniel, her husband, was sitting at the table. He always waited for her after work, even when she ran late. When Daniel saw her, he immediately noticed something was wrong. Her clothes were filthy, her hair disheveled, and the smell was undeniable. He jumped up from his chair, rounding the table to get to her. "Charlotte, what happened? Are you okay?" His voice was calm, but his eyes were full of concern. She couldn't hold back anymore. Tears streamed down her face as she told him everything. Every moment, every word the men said, and every bit of humiliation she endured. Daniel listened silently, his fists clenching tighter with every word until his knuckles turned white. Anger boiled within him, but he stayed composed. He knew the most important thing was to support Charlotte. "You did the right thing by telling me," he said when she finished. "They will answer for this, I promise." Charlotte, feeling some relief from his words but still uncertain, looked into his eyes. "Do you think it'll make any difference? People like that always think they can get away with it." Daniel took her hand. "They won't, not with me." The next morning, Daniel walked into his office. As the town's police chief, he had a reputation for being fair and firm. His team trusted him, and he trusted them. He gathered his best detectives and explained the situation without revealing that Charlotte was the victim. "We've got an incident that needs to be investigated quickly and thoroughly," he said. "Check the surveillance cameras, interview witnesses. I want to know who these men are, and I want them in custody by the end of the day." Meanwhile, Charlotte, still shaken but determined, decided she wouldn't hide. She went to work at the hospital despite everything, sharing her story with a few colleagues. They were shocked and offered her their support. Word of the incident began spreading through the town, and more people expressed their outrage. By evening, one of Charlotte's colleagues informed her that a video of the incident had surfaced online. One of the men had recorded her humiliation on his phone and posted it on social media, bragging about their fun. The video sparked outrage, with people sharing it and demanding justice for Charlotte. For Daniel, the video became the key piece of evidence. It showed not only the actions of the attackers, but also their faces, making identification straightforward. His team quickly identified 3 of the men. One of them turned out to be the son of a prominent local businessman, a man known for using his influence to shield his son from the consequences of his actions. When Daniel arrested the first suspect, the pressure began almost immediately. The businessman came to the station with his lawyers, trying to excuse his son's actions as a harmless joke and demanding his release. "They're just young guys who didn't think it through," the businessman said, sitting across from Daniel in his office. "Do you really want to ruin their lives over this?" Daniel stared at him coldly, anger simmering beneath the surface, but he kept his composure. "This wasn't a joke," he said firmly. "It was a crime, and I won't let it go unpunished." Meanwhile, a wave of support for Charlotte began to build in the town. Colleagues, neighbors, and friends organized a solidarity event to show they stood with her. People started sharing their own experiences of facing humiliation or injustice, highlighting the importance of standing up against such behavior. Charlotte, seeing how her story resonated with so many, found strength within herself. She decided she wouldn't let this define her as a victim, but would instead use her voice to speak for others who were too afraid to come forward. Daniel and his team were closing in on the investigation. The suspects were in custody, but the pressure on Daniel continued to mount. Ahead lay a battle against a system that often turned a blind eye to such incidents. Yet Daniel was resolute. The truth was on his side, and he would not let these men escape accountability. This part of the story shows how Charlotte and Daniel overcome challenges together, fighting not just for justice, but also for their dignity and the respect they deserve. As the investigation gained momentum, tensions in the town escalated. The arrest of one of the suspects, a young man from an influential family, sent shockwaves through the community. Rumors swirled, and whispers of intimidation and pressure began to surface. For Daniel, the police chief, this was more than just a professional duty. It had become deeply personal. The morning after the arrests, Daniel was summoned to his office for an unexpected meeting. The suspect's father, a wealthy businessman, arrived with his legal team. They were polished, confident, and intent on minimizing the consequences for the young men involved. "We've reviewed the evidence," one of the lawyers began, smoothing his tie. "While the incident was unfortunate, we believe it was a misunderstanding. There was no real harm done." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Misunderstanding?" he repeated. "The victim was humiliated in a public act that was recorded and shared online. How is that a misunderstanding?" The businessman interjected, leaning forward. "Chief, you know how boys can be. Impulsive, reckless. They didn't mean anything by it. Surely you don't want to ruin their futures over one bad decision." Daniel stared at him, his expression unflinching. He had heard this argument before. Excuses for inexcusable behavior. "This isn't about their futures," he replied firmly. "It's about holding people accountable for their actions. Everyone must face the consequences of what they've done." Despite his calm exterior, Daniel felt the weight of the situation. The pressure from powerful figures in the community could have easily swayed someone else. But Daniel had made a promise to Charlotte and to himself. Justice would be served. Meanwhile, Charlotte's story continued to spread. The video of the attack had ignited a firestorm of public outrage, not just in their town, but beyond. People were disgusted by the cruelty of the act and the casual way it had been treated by the attackers. Messages of support flooded social media, and community leaders began organizing rallies to show solidarity with Charlotte. One evening, Charlotte was invited to speak at a gathering organized in her support. At first, she hesitated. Standing in front of a crowd, reliving what had happened, was daunting. But as she looked at the messages of encouragement pouring in, she realized this was bigger than her. At the rally, she stood on the small stage, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "What happened to me was an act meant to humiliate and diminish me," she said, looking out at the crowd. "But I refuse to let it define me, and I refuse to let those responsible walk away as if it didn't matter." Her words resonated with the crowd, who erupted into applause. For many, Charlotte had become a symbol of resilience and courage. Back at the station, Daniel and his team were piecing together the case. The video provided undeniable evidence of the suspect's actions, but Daniel knew they needed more to make the charges stick. His detectives worked tirelessly, interviewing witnesses and collecting statements. One key breakthrough came when a local shop owner, whose security camera had captured the incident from a different angle, came forward with additional footage. The video not only confirmed the suspect's actions, but also showed their faces clearly, leaving no room for denial. With this new evidence, the case against the suspects was rock solid. Arrest warrants for the remaining individuals were issued, and the community watched closely as the wheels of justice turned when the suspects were brought in for questioning. Their demeanor was a mix of arrogance and fear. Some tried to downplay their actions, insisting it had been a harmless prank. Others remained silent, avoiding eye contact. Daniel, however, was resolute. He met each of them in the interrogation room, making it clear that this was not something they could brush aside. "This wasn't a joke," he told them. "You targeted someone, humiliated them, and thought there would be no consequences. But actions have consequences, and now you'll face them." Their parents, particularly the influential families, continued to push back, attempting to discredit the investigation. Yet the evidence was irrefutable, and Daniel refused to back down. As the trial date approached, the town was buzzing with anticipation. The courtroom was packed with spectators, reporters, and supporters of Charlotte. The suspects' families hired top-tier lawyers, hoping to reduce the charges or negotiate a deal. During the trial, the video footage and witness testimonies painted a clear picture of the events. The defense argued for leniency, citing the suspect's youth and good character. But the prosecution, armed with undeniable evidence, emphasized the harm caused by their actions. Charlotte testified with poise and courage, recounting the incident and its emotional impact. Her words left a profound impression on the courtroom. In the end, the court delivered its verdict. The suspects were found guilty of multiple charges, including harassment and public misconduct. They were sentenced to community service, fines, and mandatory participation in programs focused on empathy and accountability. While some argued the punishment wasn't severe enough, it sent a clear message: actions like theirs would not go unpunished. For Charlotte and Daniel, the resolution of the case brought a sense of closure. While the scars of the incident remained, they were proud of what they had achieved together. Charlotte's courage and Daniel's unwavering commitment to justice had not only held the attackers accountable, but also inspired their community to stand against such acts. Their story became a testament to the power of resilience, love, and the pursuit of justice, proving that even in the face of intimidation and pressure, doing the right thing could lead to meaningful change. The trial had concluded and justice had been served, but the impact of the events lingered long after the courtroom verdict. For Charlotte and Daniel, this was not just the end of a painful chapter. It was the beginning of a larger conversation about accountability, dignity, and standing up against wrongs. In the days following the verdict, the town began to reflect on what had happened. The trial had drawn widespread attention, and the details of the case forced people to confront uncomfortable truths. While many stood in solidarity with Charlotte, others questioned why such a harsh spotlight had been cast on an act they deemed a moment of poor judgment. Community meetings were held with local leaders, activists, and residents discussing how to prevent similar incidents in the future. Charlotte, though initially hesitant, agreed to participate in these discussions. Her presence was powerful. Her calm but determined voice reminded everyone of the importance of addressing harmful behavior rather than excusing it. During one meeting, a young woman approached Charlotte and shared her own story of public humiliation. "I never thought I could speak about it until I saw how strong you were," she said, her voice trembling. Charlotte realized then that her experience, though painful, had given others the courage to speak up and seek justice. The suspects, now convicted, began their sentences. They were assigned community service and highly visible roles, including cleaning public spaces and assisting with local charity events. They also attended mandatory workshops on empathy and understanding the consequences of their actions. Daniel had personally ensured that their punishment was meaningful. He worked with local organizations to design programs that didn't just punish, but also aimed to reform. He believed that change was possible, even for those who had caused harm. One of the young men, during a workshop, publicly apologized for his role in the incident. Though some questioned the sincerity of his words, others saw it as a step toward taking responsibility. Charlotte chose not to respond directly but noted privately to Daniel, "At least they're starting to think about what they did." As the dust settled, Charlotte found herself unexpectedly stepping into a role she never anticipated: an advocate for others who had faced similar situations. Her story had resonated far beyond their town, with media outlets and organizations reaching out to highlight her resilience. She began speaking at schools and community centers, sharing her experience and encouraging young people to think about the impact of their actions. Her message was clear: what you do, even in a moment, matters. It can break someone or lift them up. Choose wisely. At first, she struggled with the spotlight, but over time, she embraced the opportunity to create change. Her husband, always by her side, supported her every step of the way. "You've always been strong," he told her. "Now, others see it too." At home, life slowly returned to normal. Charlotte and Daniel focused on their family, ensuring their son felt secure and understood the values they cherished: kindness, accountability, and courage. They had open conversations about what had happened, not shying away from the difficult parts but framing them as lessons. One evening, their son asked, "Mom, does this mean bad people always get punished?" Charlotte paused before answering. "Not always," she said gently, "but it means we have to try. Standing up for what's right is how we make the world better, even if it's hard." Her words stayed with him, and as he grew, he carried that lesson forward. Over time, the story became less about the incident itself and more about the strength Charlotte and Daniel demonstrated in its aftermath. Their courage to seek justice and their refusal to back down inspired many within their community and beyond. Local leaders worked to implement policies aimed at fostering respect and accountability, such as programs in schools that focused on empathy and conflict resolution. While change came slowly, it was clear that Charlotte's story had left a lasting impact. Charlotte and Daniel, though humbled by the attention, remained grounded. For them, the most important thing was knowing they had stood together and turned a moment of pain into a powerful message of hope and perseverance. Years later, Charlotte would reflect on everything that had happened. The pain of that night had not entirely faded, but it no longer defined her. She had chosen to use her voice, to fight for justice, and to inspire others to do the same. Standing on a stage at a local event, she addressed a room filled with young people. Her final words summed up her journey: "We can't always control what happens to us, but we can control how we respond. Choose to stand, choose to fight, and choose to believe in the power of doing what's right. You are stronger than you think." The crowd erupted into applause, but for Charlotte, the true victory was seeing the hope in their eyes, a sign that the seeds of change had been planted and would continue to grow.